For 3,000 years, one of the most famous destruction stories in human history has haunted the imagination of billions. A city so wicked, so corrupt, so beyond redemption, that God himself rained down fire and sulfur from the heavens, Sodom and Gomorrah. The names have become synonymous with divine judgment, with moral collapse, with the ultimate consequence of evil. But here is the question that has driven archaeologists, scholars, and explorers for over a century. Did it actually happen? Is there real archaeological evidence for the destruction of Sodom? Or is this one of the most famous stories in the Bible that exists only in the realm of faith and literature? In 2026, after decades of excavations, geological surveys, and scientific studies, the answer is far more complicated and far more fascinating than anyone expected. Let's begin with what the biblical text actually says, because if we're going to search for Sodom, we need to know what we're looking for. Genesis chapter 13 describes the plain of the Jordan as well-watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the destruction. The text describes 5 cities of the plain: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, also called Zoar. Genesis 14 mentions that the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits. Genesis 19 describes the actual destruction. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, from the Lord out of the heavens. The cities were destroyed. Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. Smoke rose from the land like smoke from a furnace. These are the details we would expect to find if this event actually happened. A well-watered plain, 5 cities, evidence of sudden, catastrophic destruction by fire, tar or bitumen deposits, a location in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, and ideally, evidence of abandonment after the destruction. For over a century, archaeologists have been searching, and they've found several candidates. But here is where the story gets controversial. Candidate number 1, the Southern Dead Sea theory. This is the traditional view. For centuries, Jewish and Christian interpreters assumed Sodom was located south or southeast of the Dead Sea. The logic seemed sound. Genesis 14:10 identifies the valley of Siddim with the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea. The southern end of the Dead Sea is shallow, suggesting it might have been a plain that was later submerged. But there's a problem. The southern Dead Sea region is not well watered. It's arid. It's barren. It doesn't match the description in Genesis 13 of a garden-like paradise. And despite decades of searching, archaeologists have found limited evidence from the relevant time period in this region. Candidate number 2, Bab edh-Dhra and Numeira. In the 1960s through the 1980s, archaeologists excavated 2 sites southeast of the Dead Sea, Bab edh-Dhra and Numeira. Both showed evidence of destruction by fire. Both dated to the early Bronze Age, around 3,300 to 2000 BCE. For a moment, it seemed like the discovery might have been made. But then the dating came back, and it revealed a fatal problem. Bab edh-Dhra was destroyed around 2350 BCE. Numeira was destroyed around 2600 BCE. That's a difference of approximately 250 years. The biblical account describes simultaneous destruction, all the cities of the plain destroyed together in a single catastrophic event. These sites were destroyed centuries apart. Most scholars now reject this identification. Candidate number 3, Tall el-Hammam. And then, in 2005, everything changed, or so it seemed. Dr. Stephen Collins, an archaeologist from Trinity Southwest University, began excavations at a site called Tall el-Hammam in modern-day Jordan, 13 kilometers northeast of the Dead Sea, in the southern Jordan Valley. And what he found would capture headlines around the world for the next 15 years. Tall el-Hammam was a major city during the Middle Bronze Age, one of the largest in the southern Jordan Valley. Around 1650 BCE, it was destroyed. The evidence showed a massive destruction layer, melted pottery, burned mud brick, evidence of intense heat. The site was abandoned for approximately 700 years after the destruction. Collins and his team argued this was Sodom. The location fit the description of the plain of the Jordan. The destruction was catastrophic. The abandonment was long-term. It seemed to match. But then, in 2021, they made an even bolder claim. A paper was published in Nature Scientific Reports, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals. The authors, including Collins, claimed the destruction was caused by a cosmic airburst, a meteor explosion in the atmosphere. They argued temperatures exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius. They suggested this event inspired the Genesis account. The media went wild. "Scientific evidence for Sodom's destruction," the headlines proclaimed. And then, in June 2023, everything collapsed. Nature's scientific reports officially retracted the paper. The journal stated, the article does not meet the journal's editorial standards. Specifically, the authors did not adequately disclose that the evidence and interpretations presented in the article are disputed within the archaeological and scientific communities. The retraction was devastating. Leading archaeologists had been criticizing the tall el-Hammam claims for years. Dr. Aaron Meir from Bar Ilan University called the methodology problematic. Dr. Christopher Rolston from George Washington University published detailed critiques noting the chronological problems. The dating was wrong. 1650 BCE doesn't match any reasonable date for the patriarchal narratives. There were no contemporary inscriptions mentioning Sodom. The evidence was being overinterpreted. The reasoning was circular. Assume the Bible is historically accurate. Find a destruction layer. Claim it must be Sodom. The retraction was a major embarrassment, and it left the search for Sodom back at square one. So where does that leave us in 2026? Here is what we know for certain. The Dead Sea region has bitumen, tar, deposits. This has been historically documented since ancient times. Pliny the Elder mentioned bitumen floating in the Dead Sea in the 1st century AD. The region sits on the Dead Sea Transform Fault and is geologically active with frequent earthquakes. These are established facts. Here is what we also know for certain. There is no definitive archaeological evidence for the biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah. Not at Tall el-Hammam, not at Bab edh-Dhra, not at any other site. The scholarly consensus is clear. The identification of any specific site with Sodom is highly speculative and not accepted by mainstream archaeology. Dr. William Dever, one of the most prominent biblical archaeologists of the last century, stated, "The search for Sodom is a classic example of biblical archaeology gone wrong. People start with the biblical text and try to make the archaeology fit rather than letting the evidence speak for itself." Dr. Israel Finkelstein from Tel Aviv University put it even more directly. The patriarchal narratives, including the Sodom story, are literary compositions from the Iron Age, not historical accounts of the Bronze Age. So what is the most honest conclusion we can draw? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah exists. It's in Genesis chapters 13 through 19. It's referenced throughout the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It's one of the most influential moral narratives in human history. Whether it is historical fact or theological literature depends entirely on your presuppositions. If you approach the text with faith, assuming divine inspiration and historical accuracy, you will find ways to harmonize the archaeological evidence with the biblical account. You will point to Tall el-Hammam, to the destruction layers, to the geographic descriptions. You will argue that the Airburst theory, despite its retraction, still has merit. You will maintain that faith requires believing what cannot be proven. If you approach the text with historical critical methodology, assuming the Bible is a human document composed over centuries, you will see the Sodom narrative differently. You will note that the story explains why the Dead Sea region is barren and salty, why bitumen is found in the area, why the land looks the way it looks. You will recognize it as an ideological story, a narrative that explains the origin of something. You will see it as a moral tale about hospitality, about justice, about the consequences of evil. You will note that similar destruction myths exist in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Both approaches are intellectually honest if they acknowledge their presuppositions. The problem arises when people claim absolute certainty where none exists. Here is what we can say with complete confidence. The search for Sodom has produced fascinating archaeology. Tall el-Hammam was a real city that was catastrophically destroyed. Bab edh-Dhra and Numirah show evidence of ancient destruction. The Dead Sea region is geologically active and has bitumen deposits. These are facts. What we cannot say, what the evidence does not support, is that any specific site is definitively Sodom, that any specific destruction event matches the biblical account, that the story is historically accurate in all its details. In 2026, after over a century of archaeological investigation, Sodom remains elusive. not because the evidence is hidden, but because the evidence, when examined honestly, doesn't point conclusively in any single direction. Perhaps that is okay. Perhaps the power of the Sodom narrative was never in its historical factuality. Perhaps it was always in its moral force, in its warning about the consequences of injustice, in its exploration of hospitality and cruelty, in its depiction of one man bargaining with God for the sake of the righteous. The smoke that rose from the plain like smoke from a furnace may or may not have been real, but the story continues to burn in the human imagination, challenging us, warning us, asking us what we would do if we found ourselves in the city. Whether Sodom was real or legendary, the question it poses remains urgent, and perhaps that is the most important evidence of all.